Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 32 of the Bible in 365. Today we are taking a look at Leviticus chapters 5 through chapter 7. You know the drill. Let's get started. All right, folks, so picking up in Leviticus chapter 5. Leviticus chapter 5 begins by explaining the rules for the giving of a guilt offering. Essentially, a guilt offering was when a person had become unclean because of their sins and they had to repent. It talks about accidents, or essentially when someone commits a sin and they are unaware of their sin, and then their sin is brought to their attention, and the process of essentially becoming ceremonially clean again. And so Leviticus chapter 5 gives us several examples. If you look, it says or, this term over and over and over again to give us a lot of different examples of the different types of scenarios that could happen. And that way the people aren't really left with questions. And so essentially one of the first things that is mentioned was the sin of not speaking the truth when being called upon. It specifically discusses this idea of innocent people being found guilty for crimes they didn't commit. So in this case, it's really important to speak up and to help protect those who are innocent. So we see that in this chapter. Now, Leviticus also talks about sins of like touching unclean animals or unclean people. In addition, it talks about people taking oaths and swearing oaths, and doing things without thinking or premeditating, and essentially how they've committed sin. And it says that God essentially believes that making thoughtless promises was wrong, and a guilt offering needed to be given for atonement. Now there's also a list of instructions for accidental sin offerings. So if a person commits any type of accidental sin, they're supposed to confess as soon as they realized it, and they're supposed to bring a female lamb or female goat to the tent as their offering. The other cool thing here, it talks about provisions. If someone can't afford a female goat, how they can bring 2 pigeons or 2 doves, and then if they can't afford that, they could bring a form of grain, some fine flour. So essentially it's like a tiered system based upon what you could afford. So God is not just making it difficult for poor people to be able to worship him or come and confess their sins and receive atonement for their sin. And so these sin offerings were a burnt offering. And then there's other options, essentially, like I said, for guilt offering. Moving forward to Leviticus chapter 6. In Leviticus chapter 6, it gives us essentially a detailed overview of what sin is and what God expects a person to do once they have committed a sin. So it talks about all these different types of sin, and the Lord explains these to Moses and what the people should do when they have committed one of these sins. So some of these are being untruthful, stealing, deceiving, swearing falsely. And then essentially it's all about restitution and making things right for what they stole, or giving back, or telling the truth after they've told a lie. And so really it's trying to make things right and to restore relationship. Here there's also details regarding the burnt offerings, what the priest should wear during the process, and what is meant of the offering, and what God expects from Aaron and his sons, and then how part of the offering is supposed to be eaten by Aaron and his sons. So this is a memorial, essentially, but then also it's a way that Israel provides for Aaron and his sons, because their full-time job is being priests, so they can't go out and work in the fields and grow crops and whatnot. So this is God also providing for them. God also gives them other instructions within Leviticus chapter 6. Essentially, like if any blood from a sacrifice fell on a person's clothes, they were instructed to wash the clothes in a holy place and different things like that. Um, so it's very specific and talks about the seriousness of sin and remaining clean and holy before the Lord. Moving forward to chapter 7. Leviticus chapter 7 talks about trespasses, trespass offerings, peace offerings, wave offerings. So it talks about essentially how a priest is to conduct a guilt offering, how the priest has to kill the animal and then sprinkle the blood around the altar, how they have to remove the fat along with the kidneys and the liver, and it goes through this entire process. And then they finally bring it to the altar and offer it to the Lord. And only priests could eat of the guilt offering. They also give instructions for fellowship offerings, which is a way to show gratitude to God. And along with the sacrifice, you could bring unleavened bread, oil, and fine flour. And this was okay for the people to eat the meat of the fellowship offering on the same day in order to show thanks. But none of the meat should be left until the next morning. So they had to eat it all or burn it all. Now, another thing, they can't eat meat that had touched something unclean, or they would be separated or cut off from Israel. Lastly, in chapter 7, it talks about fellowship offerings and how these are supposed to be presented individually to the Lord, how they have to bring the fat to the priest who would present it to God, and then the priests keep the breast of the animal for themselves. And then the right thigh of the offering would go to the priest as a gift. And then the left thigh sometimes was reserved as well for a priest. And then God said there was also their share of the fellowship offerings. So ultimately, it is here at the end of chapter 7 that we end our reading for tonight. So tomorrow our story is going to pick back up as we take a look at Leviticus chapter 8 beginning in verse 1, and we're going to discuss through Leviticus chapter 11 ending in verse 8. All right, folks, as always, God bless.